I'll begin this week with some scheduling announcements for President Trump's very busy week ahead. Tomorrow, President Trump will host his 9th cabinet meeting of the year alongside his incredible cabinet, who continue to deliver for the American people at a record pace. Later in the afternoon tomorrow, the president will make an announcement in the Oval Office on his initiative to create Trump accounts to give the next generation of Americans a jump start on savings. It will be a very exciting announcement indeed, especially for all of the parents across the country with young children and babies. On Thursday, President Trump will host the presidents of the Republic of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo to sign the historic peace and economic agreement.
Okay, so the Pentagon is in absolute meltdown right now, and what we're seeing is something that could fundamentally reshape the relationship between the commander-in-chief and the United States military. We're talking about senior military officials reportedly distancing themselves from Trump after allegations of serious crimes have surfaced, and the implications here are absolutely massive. Now, this isn't just about one scandal or one investigation. This is about whether the chain of command can function when the person at the top of that chain is facing credible allegations of criminal conduct. This is about whether generals and admirals are willing to follow orders from someone they believe may have violated the very laws they've sworn to uphold. And this is happening right now in real time as Trump tries to consolidate power in his second term while facing what sources are calling the most serious allegations of his entire political career. Now, before we dive into exactly what's happening here, let's be clear about something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll either sensationalize everything into oblivion or downplay stories that actually matter because they're worried about access or advertising dollars. That's why we built Politic Insane to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of conversations inside the Pentagon, senior military leaders have begun what one official described as a strategic withdrawal from their traditional close coordination with the White House. This started approximately 2 weeks ago, when details emerged about alleged criminal conduct that reportedly involves everything from potential violations of classified information protocols to possible obstruction of justice related to ongoing federal investigations. Now, we need to be careful here because the exact nature of these allegations is still emerging and some details remain under seal as part of active grand jury proceedings. But what we know for certain is this: the allegations are serious enough that military lawyers, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, have reportedly been consulting with senior Pentagon leadership about their obligations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and their oath to the Constitution versus their duty to follow orders from the civilian commander-in-chief. The breaking point appears to have come during a classified briefing that took place at the Pentagon roughly 10 days ago. During this briefing, which involved the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the service chiefs, and several combatant commanders, information was presented that allegedly detailed criminal conduct serious enough to warrant what military sources are calling an unprecedented internal review of command authority protocols. One person familiar with the briefing said that the atmosphere in the room fundamentally changed when the full scope of the allegations became clear. These are men and women who have spent their entire careers in service to the nation, who understand chain of command as a sacred principle, and they were suddenly confronted with a situation where following that chain of command might mean becoming complicit in activities they believe violate federal law. What makes this absolutely explosive is that we're not talking about political disagreements or policy disputes. Military officers are trained to set aside personal political views and follow lawful orders from civilian leadership. That's fundamental to how our constitutional system works, but the key word there is lawful. Under military law, under the UCMJ, under the basic principles that govern how our armed forces operate, service members have not just the right, but the duty to refuse unlawful orders. And what we're hearing from sources inside the Pentagon is that senior military leaders are now grappling with whether certain directives coming from the White House fall into that category of potentially unlawful orders that they are obligated to refuse. The White House has gone into full damage control mode. Press secretary has been doing the rounds claiming that these reports are completely false, that the relationship between the president and military leadership is stronger than ever, that these are just politically motivated leaks designed to undermine the administration. But here's the problem with that narrative. The sources for these reports aren't coming from Democratic operatives or opposition research. They're coming from within the military itself, from career officers who have served under both Republican and Democratic administrations, who have zero interest in playing politics, but who are deeply concerned about their legal obligations and their duty to the Constitution. And this is where things start to unravel. Because once you have senior military officials questioning whether they can legally follow orders from their commander-in-chief, you're not just dealing with a political crisis. You're dealing with a constitutional crisis that strikes at the very heart of civilian control of the military. Our entire system of government is built on the principle that the military answers to elected civilian leadership. That principle has held through wars, through impeachments, through every crisis in American history. But that principle assumes that the civilian leadership is operating within the bounds of law. When that assumption breaks down, when military leaders believe they may be receiving orders from someone who is actively engaged in criminal conduct, the entire foundation starts to crack. Let's talk about what the actual allegations reportedly involve, because this is crucial to understanding why the military's response is so dramatic. According to sources familiar with the ongoing investigations, the allegations include potential violations of federal statutes related to the handling of classified national security information. Now, we've heard about classified document cases before, but what makes this different, what has Pentagon lawyers apparently so concerned, is that these allegations reportedly involve not just mishandling documents, but potentially sharing classified information with individuals who lack security clearances, possibly including foreign nationals. If true, that's not a paperwork violation. That's potential espionage-adjacent activity that strikes directly at national security. There are also allegations, according to multiple reports, related to obstruction of justice. Specifically, there are claims that Trump or officials acting on his behalf attempted to interfere with ongoing federal investigations by directing subordinates to withhold evidence, to provide false testimony, or to destroy documents subject to subpoena. Again, if these allegations are proven, we're not talking about political hardball. We're talking about federal crimes that carry serious prison time. And for military officers who have spent their careers upholding the rule of law, who have prosecuted service members for far lesser offenses under the UCMJ, the idea of taking orders from someone credibly accused of such conduct creates an impossible ethical and legal dilemma. Then there's a third category of allegations that sources describe as involving potential abuse of military resources for personal or political gain. The details here are still murky, but reports suggest possible misuse of military aircraft, possible direction of Pentagon resources toward projects or investigations that serve Trump's personal interests rather than national security interests, and possible attempts to politicize military promotions and assignments in ways that violate regulations designed to keep the armed forces nonpartisan. Each of these, if substantiated, would represent serious violations of federal law and military regulations. Now, here's where this becomes a lot bigger than it looks on the surface. The United States military is the most powerful fighting force in human history. It commands resources, technology, and capabilities that dwarf those of any other institution on Earth. And the entire world has organized itself around the assumption that this military force is under stable, lawful, predictable control. When you start to see cracks in that control, when you start to see military leaders publicly or privately distancing themselves from their commander-in-chief, every adversary and every ally starts to recalculate. Think about what's happening right now in terms of global security. We have ongoing tensions with China over Taiwan. And we have a hot war in Ukraine where U.S. military aid and intelligence support are absolutely critical to Ukrainian resistance against Russia. We have persistent terrorist threats, nuclear proliferation concerns with Iran and North Korea, and complex military operations happening in dozens of countries around the world at any given moment. All of this requires a functioning chain of command. All of this requires that when the president gives an order related to military operations, that order is executed swiftly and without question by commanders who trust that the order is lawful and serves national interests. But what happens when that trust breaks down? What happens when a combatant commander receives an order to move assets or engage forces and has to stop and think, is this order serving national security, or is this order serving Trump's personal interests? Is this order lawful, or am I being directed to participate in something that could be criminal? That split second of hesitation, that pause to consult with lawyers before executing orders, that's not how military command is supposed to work. And that hesitation, that uncertainty, is exactly what adversaries look for. It's what they exploit. Intelligence services in Moscow and Beijing and Tehran, they're watching this situation incredibly closely. They're looking for any sign that the U.S. command structure is fractured, that there's daylight between the White House and the Pentagon, that military leaders might not execute orders with the speed and certainty that has always characterized American military operations. And here's the brutal reality. Even the perception of this kind of fracture, even the appearance that the military might not fully trust its commander-in-chief, degrades deterrence. It makes adversaries more likely to test boundaries, to probe for weaknesses, to take risks they wouldn't take if they believed the U.S. military command structure was solid. Okay, let's break down what this actually means because we need to look at this from multiple angles to really understand the full scope of what's happening. First, understand that the military's relationship with the presidency is governed by an incredibly complex web of law, regulation, tradition, and constitutional principle. Like, the president is the commander-in-chief, that's explicit in Article 2 of the Constitution, but the military doesn't swear an oath to the president. They swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That distinction matters enormously. It means that a service member's ultimate loyalty is to the Constitution and to the rule of law, not to any individual person, even the president. This principle has been tested before in American history, but rarely in circumstances quite like this. During Watergate, there were serious concerns about Nixon's stability and whether he might issue erratic military orders as the walls closed in. Defense Secretary James Schlesinger reportedly took steps to ensure that any unusual orders from the White House would be carefully reviewed, but even then, Nixon wasn't facing allegations of crimes directly related to national security or military operations. What we're dealing with now is potentially different in kind, not just in degree. Second, think about the precedent this sets. If senior military leaders can effectively create distance between themselves and a president based on allegations of criminal conduct, even before those allegations result in indictments or convictions, what does that mean for civilian control of the military going forward? On one hand, you could argue that the military is simply fulfilling its duty to refuse unlawful orders and to maintain loyalty to the Constitution above loyalty to an individual. That's exactly what we want from our military leaders. But on the other hand, there's a real danger here of the military becoming an independent political actor, of generals and admirals making their own determinations about which civilian leaders they will and won't follow based on their own assessment of those leaders' legal or ethical standing. This is the kind of thing that happens in countries with weak democratic institutions, where the military becomes a power unto itself, where generals decide which presidents they'll support and which they'll undermine. That's not a road we want to go down in the United States. The principle of firm, absolute civilian control of the military is too important, but maintaining that principle requires that civilian leaders actually stay within the bounds of law. When they don't, when a president is credibly accused of serious crimes, what are military leaders supposed to do? There's no good answer here. Every option is bad. Following orders from someone who might be a criminal makes you complicit. Refusing those orders breaks the chain of command. It's a genuine constitutional crisis with no clean resolution. Third, think about what this means for military morale and readiness. Our service members, from the newest recruit to the most senior officer, have been trained to believe in the chain of command, to trust that orders coming down from above are lawful and serve the nation's interests. When that trust is shaken, when service members start to question whether their leaders are acting legally, it affects everything. It affects retention, because good people don't want to serve in an organization where they might be ordered to participate in criminal activity. It affects recruitment because young people looking at military service want to believe they'll be serving their country, not serving one man's personal interests. And it affects readiness, because a military that's consumed by internal legal and ethical debates about command authority is a military that's not fully focused on training, preparing, and executing its core national security mission. Now, let's talk about the political dimension, because this is happening against the backdrop of the 2026 midterm elections. Trump came into his second term with a narrow but workable majority in Congress. Republicans control both the House and the Senate, though the margins are thin. But this kind of crisis, this breakdown in the relationship between the president and the military, is exactly the kind of thing that terrifies moderate Republicans who are already nervous about Trump's second term. You've got senators and representatives from purple districts who are facing tough re-election fights, and they're watching the military, the institution that polls show Americans trust more than any other, essentially saying they're not sure they can work with this president. That's political poison. Democrats, of course, are going to use this to maximum advantage. They're going to argue that Trump is too unstable, too criminal, too dangerous to be trusted with command of the military. They're going to bring in retired generals and admirals to testify before Congress about the importance of lawful orders and the dangers of a commander-in-chief who doesn't respect the rule of law. They're going to make military distrust of Trump a central theme of every campaign speech between now and November 2026. And it's going to work with a lot of voters, especially independent voters and college-educated suburbanites who are already skeptical of Trump, but who might have voted Republican for economic or other policy reasons. When you lose the military as a political asset, when the armed forces go from being something that rallies voters to your side to being something that raises questions about your fitness for office, you're in serious political trouble. There's also the question of what happens inside the Republican Party itself. The military has always been a core constituency for Republicans. Republican candidates wrap themselves in the flag, talk about supporting our troops, make a big deal about being the party of national security. But if active duty and retired military officers are openly questioning Trump's fitness to command, if families of service members start to worry that their loved ones are being led by someone who might be putting them in danger for personal rather than national reasons, that's a massive problem. For Republican electoral prospects, you could start to see fractures within the party, with some Republicans distancing themselves from Trump to maintain credibility with military voters, while others double down in loyalty to the president. That kind of split could be absolutely devastating heading into 2026 and beyond. And here's where it gets even worse. This affects everything Trump wants to accomplish in his second term. He came in with an ambitious agenda. He wanted to reshape immigration policy, overhaul trade relationships, potentially restructure alliances like NATO, take a harder line with China, and execute a very specific vision of American power in the world. But all of that requires a military that trusts him and is willing to execute his directives without hesitation. If military leaders are second-guessing every order, if they're consulting with lawyers before implementing presidential directives, if they're creating informal channels to slow walk or resist policies they think might be illegal, then Trump's entire agenda grinds to a halt. You can't execute a bold foreign policy if your military isn't behind you. You can't project American power if there's visible daylight between the White House and the Pentagon. And you certainly can't maintain global leadership if adversaries and allies alike can see that your own military doesn't fully trust you. Think about specific policy areas where this matters. Trump has talked about potentially using military force to address the border situation, deploying active duty troops in ways that previous administrations avoided because of posse comitatus concerns. If military leaders are already skeptical of Trump's legal judgment, do you think they're going to be eager to execute orders that push the boundaries of domestic military deployment? Trump has talked about taking a much more aggressive stance toward Mexico's cartels, possibly including cross-border military operations. Do you think military commanders are going to be comfortable executing those operations if they're not confident that the orders are coming from sound legal and strategic analysis rather than from Trump's personal impulses? What about the situation in Ukraine? The United States has been the backbone of military support for Ukraine's defense against Russia, but that support requires constant high-level coordination between the White House and the Pentagon, between political decisions about what aid to provide and military decisions about how to get that aid into Ukrainian hands effectively. If that relationship is poisoned, if there's distrust and second-guessing at every level, it affects the flow of aid, it affects intelligence sharing, it affects everything that makes U.S. support effective. And Russia's watching. Moscow would love nothing more than to see the U.S. command structure in disarray, because it makes it easier for them to achieve their goals in Ukraine and beyond. Then there's China. Beijing has been testing U.S. resolve in the Pacific for years, and the Biden administration, to its credit, worked hard to rebuild military-to-military communication channels with China that had broken down. Those channels exist to prevent miscalculation, to make sure that when U.S. and Chinese military assets are operating in proximity, everyone knows what the rules are and how to avoid accidental escalation. But those channels require trust at the highest levels. If Chinese military leaders look at the situation in Washington and conclude that the U.S. chain of command is fractured, that the president and his generals aren't on the same page, it changes their calculus about what risks they can take. It makes them more likely to test boundaries, to probe for weaknesses, to take actions they might not take if they believed the U.S. command structure was solid and unified. Let's also talk about what this means for America's alliances, because this is where the international dimension really comes into focus. NATO, the cornerstone of U.S. security policy for the past 75 years, is built on the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. But that principle only works if allies believe that when the chips are down, the United States will actually fulfill its commitment to come to their defense. And that belief requires trust in the U.S. president and confidence that the U.S. military will execute the president's orders to defend allies. If European leaders look at what's happening in Washington and start to doubt whether Trump can effectively command the U.S. military, if they start to worry that military leaders might slow walk or resist orders to defend Baltic states or Poland or other NATO members in a crisis, it fundamentally undermines deterrence. This is exactly what Putin wants. Russia's entire strategy for the past decade has been to drive wedges between the United States and its European allies, to make NATO members doubt American commitment, to create enough uncertainty that European countries start making their own security arrangements that don't assume U.S. backing. If the current crisis gives European leaders reasons to doubt U.S. reliability, if it accelerates European moves towards strategic autonomy and away from dependence on American security guarantees, that's a geopolitical disaster. It reshapes the global balance of power in ways that advantage Russia and China and disadvantage the United States. Our Asian allies face similar concerns. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, these countries have built their entire security strategies around the assumption of U.S. military backing. They face real threats from China and North Korea, and their ability to resist pressure from those threats depends on confidence that the United States will be there if things go bad. But that confidence requires belief that the U.S. president can actually command the military effectively, that when he gives an order to defend an ally, that order will be executed without hesitation. If allies in Asia start to doubt that, if they start to see the same cracks in the U.S. command structure that everyone else is seeing, it changes their entire strategic calculus. It makes them more likely to accommodate Chinese pressure, more likely to hedge their bets, more likely to distance themselves from the United States. And that's a recipe for American strategic isolation in the world's most important region. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this situation is incredibly fluid and could evolve in several different directions. The immediate question is whether the allegations against Trump result in formal legal action. If a grand jury returns indictments, if Trump is actually charged with crimes, the political and military situation becomes even more acute. You'd have a sitting president, the commander-in-chief, under criminal indictment, potentially facing trial while still trying to run the government and command the military. There's no good historical precedent for that. The closest we've come is Clinton's impeachment, but those charges were related to personal misconduct, not crimes directly tied to national security or military command. If indictments come down, especially if they involve serious national security crimes like mishandling classified information or obstruction of justice related to military matters, the pressure on Trump to resign would be enormous. You'd have editorial boards calling for resignation, retired military officers going on television to say the president needs to step down, possibly even some Republicans in Congress quietly suggesting that resignation is the only way to restore stability. But Trump has never responded well to pressure, and he's shown throughout his political career that his instinct is to fight rather than resign. So you could end up with a situation where he's fighting criminal charges, fighting impeachment proceedings if Democrats move in that direction after 2026, and trying to maintain command of the military all at the same time. That's a recipe for absolute chaos. There's also the possibility that the allegations are investigated but don't result in formal charges, either because prosecutors conclude they can't prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, or because of Justice Department policies about indicting sitting presidents. If that happens, Trump will claim total vindication, will attack everyone who raised concerns as part of a political witch hunt, and will try to use his survival as a cudgel against his opponents. But even in that scenario, the damage is done. The military's trust has been broken, allied confidence has been shaken, and the questions about Trump's fitness to command will persist throughout his second term and into whatever political future he has beyond that. Another scenario involves Congress. If the allegations are serious enough, if evidence emerges that clearly shows criminal conduct, you could see new impeachment proceedings, The House would have to bring charges, and the Senate would have to try them. But we've been down this road before with Trump, and both times the Senate failed to convict. Republicans, even those who privately have serious concerns, have been unwilling to vote to remove him from office. Would this time be different? Maybe if the allegations are serious enough and if military leaders make clear that they can't work with him, but maybe not, especially if Republicans calculate that removing Trump would fracture their party and hand total control to Democrats. The political dynamics of impeachment are brutal and often have little to do with the actual facts of the case. There's also the question of what the military itself does. Right now, what we're seeing is a quiet distancing, a strategic withdrawal from close coordination. But if the situation escalates, if Trump starts issuing orders that military leaders believe are clearly illegal, you could see open defiance. You could have a scenario where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or the Secretary of Defense publicly refuses to execute a presidential order and dares Trump to fire them. That would be a constitutional crisis of the highest order, the kind of thing that would dominate every news cycle and potentially bring the government to a standstill. It's hard to imagine how democracy survives that kind of open confrontation between the president and the military. So here's the bottom line. What we're watching right now is not just another Trump scandal. It's not just another chapter in the long-running political warfare that has defined his entire time in public life. What we're watching is a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between the commander-in-chief and the United States military. And that breakdown is happening because of credible allegations of serious criminal conduct that strike at the heart of national security. This matters because it affects everything. It affects military readiness. It affects America's ability to project power globally. It affects our alliances, it emboldens our adversaries, and it raises profound questions about civilian control of the military that go to the core of how our constitutional system works. If these allegations are proven, if Trump did what he's accused of doing, then the military's response is not just justified, but required. Officers who swear an oath to the Constitution cannot and should not follow orders from someone engaged in criminal activity that threatens national security. But even if the allegations are never proven in court, even if Trump manages to survive this politically and legally, the damage has been done. The trust that's required for effective military command has been broken, and rebuilding that trust will take years, if it can be rebuilt at all. For Americans watching this unfold, the stakes could not be higher. We're heading into 2026 with a president whose own military doesn't fully trust him, with allies questioning American reliability, with adversaries looking for opportunities to exploit perceived weakness, and with a political system that seems increasingly unable to resolve fundamental crises about presidential power and accountability. This is not sustainable. Something has to give. Either Trump finds a way to restore military confidence, which seems nearly impossible given the nature of the allegations, or the situation escalates to a point where the constitutional crisis becomes unavoidable. Either way, this is a defining moment not just for Trump's presidency, but for the entire structure of American civil-military relations. Keep your eyes on this. Watch how military leaders respond in the coming days and weeks. Watch whether any of them go public with their concerns or whether they continue to express their distance quietly through channels. Watch how congressional Republicans react, whether they continue to defend Trump or whether some of them start to break ranks as military concerns become more public. Watch how allies respond, whether they start hedging their security bets or whether they express confidence in American commitments. And watch how Trump himself reacts, because if history is any guide, he's not going to take this quietly. He's going to fight back hard. He's going to attack his critics, and he's going to try to rally his base against what he'll call a military establishment that's trying to undermine him. How that fight plays out could determine the future of American democracy and America's role in the world for decades to come. This story is far from over.